Hello, everyone, and welcome to CCAG's monthly public broadcast for October 2023. I am Miti Jonal Tan, and I am a full-time climate justice activist from the Philippines, and I'm delighted to be your host today. We are rapidly approaching COP28, and the stakes for the annual climate summit have never been higher. We'd run out of time if I listed all of the record-shattering climate events that have occurred so far in 2023. But to name a few, September was the hottest ever recorded in human history, a fact labeled absolutely gobsmackingly bananas by climate scientist Zeke Housefather. And October looks set to be the same, and Antarctica sea ice reached the lowest winter extent on record, a full million square kilometers below the previous record low in 2022. And we're seeing sea surface temperatures hit record highs for 4 months, and we're almost 1 degree Celsius hotter than is normal. And surprisingly, wildfires, extreme heat, and storms have continued to rage around the world. And against this backdrop, the IEA has released its World Energy Outlook report, which shows momentum is building unstoppably towards a global clean energy transition, but also that much stronger policies are needed if we are to keep warming at or below the planetary red line of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is quite literally it's very clear that we are at the critical juncture in human history. And recently, a coalition of scientists, including CCAG's Professor Johan Rockstrom, Professor Salim Hook, and Sir David King, published an article in the journal Bioscience, and they wrote that as scientists, we are increasingly being asked to tell the public the truth about the crises we face in simple and direct terms. And the truth is that we are shocked by the ferocity of the extreme weather events in 2023. And then they go on to state that this is our moment to make a profound difference for all life on Earth. And we must embrace it with unwavering courage and determination to create a legacy of change that will stand the test of time. I don't know how it can be any clearer than that and any simpler and any more direct. This is our moment. So today, we ask on the eve of COP28, are we and the world leaders equal to the task? Along with CCAG's panel of world-leading experts, we are joined by our guests, Lisa Van Halla, a professor of political science and expert in the governance of climate change loss and damage at University College of London, Aziz Abubakar, climate and sustainability advocate and founder of Nigeria's Sustainable Solutions for Green Growth, and of course, Omnia El Omrani, youth envoy to the president of COP27, among other things. Thank you so much to everyone for being here, and we begin today's session with an address by Dr. Christophe McGlade, CCAG member, head of IEA's Energy Supply Unit, and co-author of the World Energy Outlook report. Christophe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mitzi. I'm just going to share a few slides to help frame some of the discussion that you have already set out the parameters and the key issues that we are facing today. There is a lot of bad news out there when it comes to climate damages. CO2 emissions are likely to reach an all-time high this year. And we also need to remember that energy prices are high and volatile, and that has very severe impacts on many people around the world, particularly the world's poorest. But despite some of this negative aspects that we hear, there are causes for optimism. And where we see some of the real key areas of optimism are around some of the growth rates there have been for key clean energy technologies in the past few years. There's two I want to just point out quickly that things are moving very, very fast. We look at electric car sales, for example. Just back in 2020, so 3 years ago, for every 25 cars that were sold around the world, one of those cars was electric. This year already, for every 5 cars that are sold, one of those will be electric. So we've gone from 1 in 25 2 years ago to 1 in 5 today. Solar PV is also moving really, really quickly. Capacity additions in 2022 were already 4 times higher than they were 5 years ago. And 1/3 of the solar panels that exist today were installed in just the past 2 years. So things are moving very, very quickly. And when we look at these recent developments in clean energy, a key result that we have found recently is that with today's policy settings, without any dramatic changes from governments, we will see a peak in each of the 3 main fossil fuels by the end of this decade. So we will see a peak in coal in the next few years. We will see a peak in oil and natural gas by 2030. And this represents a really huge shift from past trends. And actually, these changes that we see are happening much, much faster than most people realize. Governments, companies, financial institutions, businesses, all of those that are expecting relentless increases in fossil fuel demand going forwards could be in for a big shock. So this is very good news, because a peak in fossil fuel demand equals a peak in CO2 emissions. But while it's good news, it's nowhere near good enough. If we want to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, as you pointed out, roughly speaking, that means we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And that means that oil, gas, and coal demand would have to be substantially lower than what we can currently see here. So a simple question that this leads us to is whether it is still possible to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 and whether it is still possible to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And in the recent reports that you mentioned that we've recently released, we have a very clear answer for this. Yes, absolutely, it is still possible. In recent years, that pathway towards limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 has got narrower, but that rapid growth we've seen in clean energy is giving us hope, and it's keeping our options open. But when we think about net zero in 2050, sometimes that means that people get a bit distracted because it is a long way from now. And if we're to get on track with 2050, there's lots of big milestones and decisions that are needed in the much more immediate future. So when we think about that pathway towards net zero in 2050, that actually means that some big decisions are needed today. So for example, to get on track for net zero, that means that we do not need any new unabated coal-fired power plants to be built anywhere around the world. It also means that we don't need any new long lead time oil and gas projects or any new coal mines or coal mine extensions. When we look out slightly further than that, let's say to 2035, by 2035, the electricity sectors in advanced economies around the world will be net zero emissions if we're getting on track for 1.5. It also means that by 2035, which is not very far away from today, every single car that is sold around the world, whether that's in advanced economies, in developing economies, in emerging economies, every single car sold will be an electric vehicle. And by 2050, of course, very big things need to happen. Just to pick one of them, in 2050, 90% of electricity generation would come from renewables. Wind and solar PV alone would be supplying 70% of global electricity generation. Today, those two technologies just provide 10% of electricity. This degree of change is going to be a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And to achieve it, governments are going to need to work together to make sure that no one is left behind. And that brings us to what we really want to discuss today, which is what is needed from COP28 for energy if we are to help keep 1.5 degrees alive. And there's 5 key things that we at the IEA think need to occur, and where we need to see firm commitments from governments in Dubai to say that it was a success. The first of them is on renewables. I mentioned how important renewables are for achieving net zero emissions. We need to see a tripling in the amount of installed renewables by 2030 if we're to get on track for net zero. Renewables are well understood, they're rapidly deployable, and they're cost effective. In many parts of the world, they're the cheapest form of new generation. Besides renewables, we need to see a huge boost in energy efficiency. We need to see a doubling in the rates of efficiency improvement. This comes through installing more efficient boilers, more efficient ways we heat our homes. It comes from electrification. An electric car is much more efficient than an internal combustion engine car. And it also comes through behavioral changes. For example, frequent flyer levies can reduce the demand for flying. The third thing we need to see is a substantial reduction in fossil fuels by 2030. That tripling in renewables, that doubling in efficiency are critical to driving down fossil fuels. But if we see a clear signal from governments, that can then provide important guidance for the industry, for the fossil fuel industry, to reorientate its investments and ensure that we have a managed and orderly transition towards net zero and a managed phase down in fossil fuels. Another aspect is on fossil fuel methane emissions. Methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, and it will be impossible to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 unless we have targeted action on methane emissions. So we see a 75% reduction in methane. One of the largest sources of methane today comes from fossil fuel operations, and hopefully with the COP being hosted by one of the world's largest oil and gas producers, we can make meaningful progress on this. And a final thing that we need to see is a huge increase in clean energy investment in emerging market and developing economies. The biggest challenges where we see today are scaling up that level of investment in the countries that need it the most. This is going to require much stronger domestic policies from those countries, but also international support to attract investment into those economies. So let me just finish by saying these 5 pillars, they're a package. None of them by themselves are going to be sufficient if we are to get on track for 1.5, and all of them are needed if COP28 is to live up to the urgency that we see from climate change damages today. Thanks very much, Mitzi.
Thank you so much, Christophe. You were crystal clear, and the International Energy Agency is also crystal clear that, policies are changing, things are getting better, but we need to step it up, and it is still possible, and governments need to work together. And so, especially during the upcoming UN Climate Summit, we need to ensure that all 5 pillars simultaneously happen, and not just one, not just 2, but all of them. And so we now have a question from John Anger, a climate reporter at Bloomberg, who has shared a question about this point. John asks, a lot of COP and climate politics has focused on slashing emissions from fossil fuels used for energy, including in the EU, which he covers on a daily basis. But one of the most intractable issues will be how we start to phase down emissions from the agricultural sector. So the question is, how can this challenge be tackled, and how important is it that it starts to be prioritized soon?
Thanks, Bitsy. It's a very important point. I mentioned the importance of tackling methane emissions from fossil fuels, but actually the single largest source of methane emissions today, man-made sources of methane emissions, is the agricultural sector. And as I said, if we do not tackle methane emissions, we are not going to be able to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So it is very important that there is increased action and attention being paid to methane, not just from the energy sector, but also from agriculture. One of the problems that there is with tackling methane from agriculture is that the technologies that are needed, the approaches that are needed, are very different from what we see in the energy sector. In the energy sector today, we know what can be done about methane emissions. We have all of the technologies available to us. We know the policies, the regulations that can bring about a very substantial reduction in methane emissions from fossil fuels. That's not quite the case today with methane emissions from the agriculture sector. It's technically more challenging, and many countries haven't demonstrated that the policies can really come about to bring about a big reduction in methane. So it is very important that it's going to be addressed. Hopefully it will be a key topic of discussion at the COP. I think personally that we should be placing a lot more emphasis on methane, particularly on methane emissions from fossil fuels, but that of course shouldn't mean that we forget entirely about methane from the agricultural sector.
Thank you, Christophe. I think it's also such an important discussion because of the implications it has on people's food security and food sovereignty. And we now also have some more additional comments from Mark and Lorraine. So Mark, go ahead, and Lorraine, you can go right after.
Thank you. I think it's a very important question because it really goes back to what we can do as individuals. Because I think the most important thing is that if we actually moved away from meat and we moved to a more plant-based diet, if everybody in the world did that, then the results show that we would halve carbon emissions from food production, we would halve the amount of land we use, and we would halve the actual amount of water we use within the agricultural sector. And so I'm absolutely with Christophe. There are big changes that we can do in how we produce food, which will reduce methane emissions and carbon emissions. But actually, it's our demand for meat, particularly beef, that's driving some of these very high emissions. And so I think that's something that we really need to tackle, which is our own diet. particularly as it will make us live longer, okay? Much healthier diets are plant-based.
I was just going to make a very similar point, actually, is that often I think the climate policies focus more on the supply side, and there's plenty, of course, that can be done on the supply side and in the agricultural sector, how food is produced, but there's plenty that also can be done on the demand side. So changing diets is really what that's about, but it's also about reducing food waste. A lot of the food that is produced, including food from animal agriculture, which is the most that produces the most methane, just goes to waste. And so actually being more conscious of that and reducing food waste, as well as shifting to plant-based diets, is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Mark and Lorraine. I completely agree. And it's also about ensuring that everyone has access to these lifestyle changes across the world so that, as Christophe was mentioning earlier, we build a world where no one is left behind. And now I would like to hand it over to Professor Gustavo Ludeman here, who I understand has a question for Christophe on this. So Gustavo, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Michi. First off, I was wondering, how long will it take us to phase out fossil fuel use? If you have any recent estimate of a kind of confidence interval, the time span where we could expect this, and in terms of time and the amount of emissions till then, based on social science and also energy technical parameters. Do we have such an idea of time span?
Thanks, Gustavo. I think before we look forwards, it's worth looking back as to what's happened in this area, because if you look at previous times in the past when we have had a reduction in fossil fuel use globally, that has always been accompanied by a reduction in economic activity. So, for example, 2020, because of the pandemic, we saw a reduction in fossil fuel use, predominantly oil, but of course that was accompanied by a huge reduction in economic activity. Similarly, back in 2008, with the financial crisis, there was a reduction in GDP. There was also a reduction in fossil fuel use. So in the past, economic growth and fossil fuel use have gone hand in hand. In the future, we don't see that being the case anymore. We see that there can be continued economic growth, but you wouldn't have any further substantial increases in fossil fuel use. And actually, as I mentioned, you will see a peak in each of the fossil fuels and a slight decline. That's a big change, but as I said, it's not a big enough change. And we will need things to move much, much faster if we are to get all the way towards net zero. I would point out that there is, within our net zero scenario, we don't have a complete phasing out of all fossil fuels, because fossil fuels continue to be used in some sectors where they're not combusted. So, for example, we use an awful lot of oil today to produce plastics, and that doesn't result in any direct emissions. It causes lots of other issues to do with pollution and particularly pollution of water, but it doesn't cause any direct CO2 emissions from the use of that oil. So even in 2050, if we have net zero emissions, we will still have some oil being used for plastics. That's besides the fact that we'd have a massive increase in recycling for plastics and finding alternatives such as bio-based plastics and alternative feedstocks. There would also likely be some oil and natural gas and coal used, but when it's equipped with carbon capture and storage. We have a very small role for that in our scenarios, but other scenarios that reach net zero have a much, much larger role for carbon capture and storage. So it is not essential that we get fossil fuel use down to exactly zero to have net zero emissions. But we do need to see a very, very substantial decrease. And whether we can have that rate of decrease that's needed in our that we see in our scenarios is a key question. We don't have any blackouts. We don't have any energy shortages in our scenario because we have a huge increase in clean energy, because we have renewables coming through to provide power. We have electrification of transport, of heat, of the industry sector. All of these different factors mean that we can continue to have economic growth. We can continue to keep the lights on. We can continue to enjoy life, but we don't have the associated emissions. That decrease is very, very quick. it would be completely unprecedented from what we've seen in the past, but we think that it is perfectly possible given where we see clean energies today.
Thank you so much, Christophe, and thank you for that question, Gustav. It's I think a question that everyone has on their minds. And now I'm going to hand over to our first guest, Professor Lisa Van Halla. Lisa, could you tell us a little bit more about your expectations for COP28? And I understand that you also have a question for our panel today.
Yeah, great. So I'm a specialist in climate change, loss and damage, and particularly the politics and governance of it. We often hear at COP that the real problem is political will. And I think there's a lot more room for political scientists to be addressing these kinds of questions. And so I'm trying to encourage my colleagues to do that. I suppose let me give you a little bit of background of what I've been doing. I've been running a 6-year project now on the politics and governance of climate change, loss and damage. That's to include following the negotiations on loss and damage within the UNFCCC, but also looking at some of the implementation work. So I've been very carefully following the work of the Loss and Damage Executive Committee over this time period. And I've also been working with a wonderful group of early career scholars, trying to understand how policymakers in the Global South are trying to make sense of this concept of loss and damage in their national context, where they may be more used to thinking through the lens of climate adaptation or disaster risk management or sustainable development. And so I'm really keen to hear from this group about the current state of play on the global negotiations on a new fund and financial arrangements to address climate change, loss and damage. Let me give you a little bit of a sense of where I think we are, and then I'll put my question to the group. So the agreement to establish a new fund at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh was really hailed as a major breakthrough. Newspaper reporting used words like compensation and reparations for climate damages in their headlines, even though, of course, that language was completely absent from the agreement itself. In many ways, this agreement was long overdue. The first institutionalization of this idea of climate change, loss and damage, these impacts of climate change we're not necessarily going to be able to prevent or adapt to, or that we're choosing not to, was first introduced within this space and into international law in 2013. That's 10 years ago now. That was also a moment which was heralded as a major victory for developing countries. But progress is so slow, it's so incremental, and in some ways it's often symbolic. And this is really frustrating. This group knows better than anyone that the science is really clear that loss is already an inevitable consequence of a warming world. Many of those impacts, Mitzi, that you talked about at the beginning, floods, heat waves, wildfires, but also slower moving hazards, rising sea levels, and the degradation of land are really transforming the planet that we inhabit. And this is also causing fundamental political and social shifts. Let me give you a few examples. The physical disappearance of some states in the near future raises questions about what state sovereignty is going to mean if there is no territory. Mass movements of people in the aftermath of climate-driven disasters is pushing us to grapple with whether there is such a category as a climate refugee and what those people are owed. The loss of livelihoods, the undermining of a wide range of human rights is really shaping the foundations of what human dignity means on a changing planet. There has been increasing awareness of the complex international and local drivers of losses, right? And in this UNFCCC space, we tend to think about extreme weather events and slow onset hazards driving different kinds of losses. These tend to be bifurcated into those that are economic, declining agricultural productivity, which we've already talked about, impacts on business operations, loss of infrastructure. But there are also losses of those things that people around the world hold most dear: loss of life, loss of health, impacts on mental health, loss of cultural heritage. In this particular space, these are referred to as non-economic losses, a term I'm almost certain an economist came up with. And I think one of your colleagues, Professor Hoek, came up with the proposal that perhaps we should refer to these as human and ecosystem losses as well, to better capture what it is that we're really losing here. A big part of the conversation here has been about culpability for causing climate change. It's a key part of the debate, right? To understand as well as understanding that vulnerability to climate impacts is socially and politically shaped from the local level right up to the global. And that's what we're talking about today, that those COP conversations and how do those decisions that are made there and the willingness or lack of willingness to really implement those decisions in a meaningful way trickles down right to the lower levels. The book I'm writing is really trying to trace the messy processes of reaching political agreement to acknowledge and address the realities of climate change, loss, and damage. I've spent hundreds of hours watching these negotiations, watching the meetings of the XCOM. With my team, we've interviewed more than 150 policymakers, negotiators, secretariat staff, activists, scientists, and other experts. And what we're trying to do is really explain why we sometimes see these big agreements that are really hailed as momentous, and then things move so slowly. Professor Rajamani raised this idea of we need to manage expectations when we're talking about COP, and I understand that. I mean, the way that I diagnose this is that we have a real blockage between those who understand loss and damage through the lens of climate justice. Small island developing states, least developed countries, really understand loss and damage as a form of harm, and they focus on this idea of global injustice and responsibility and stepping up and showing leadership within this particular space. And they put that onus particularly on those historic high emitters, countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the European nations. Right? This framing views justice-based measures, including the potential for liability claims and compensation. And that language has really been rendered taboo in that UNFCCC space now. Another way of understanding the loss and damage problem, one that tends to be advocated by developed countries, is adhering to a narrower, more risk-based perspective of climate change impacts, right? Historically, this has foregrounded the uncertainty around climate impacts and climate emissions. Though, of course, the attribution science that's really developing very quickly is making those kinds of claims harder. But these actors who take this technocratic-based approach really suggest that responsibility for loss and damage lies with the leaders of vulnerable developing countries for failing to develop in a more sustainable way or for failing to adapt properly. When offering solutions, they tend to propose technocratic measures, particularly risk-based tools. Insurance schemes have been a big part of the conversation around loss and damage to date. And they tend to argue for a need to gain a better understanding before we move to really trying to address the problem. And in the meantime, the impacts of climate change continue to compound and cascade while these conversations happen. Last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, a transitional committee was tasked with setting up with this new fund on loss and damage. New fund and financial arrangements. And that language has always come together because it's been part of the compromise between developing and developed countries and their vision of what kind of finance might be available here. And so this committee has been working very hard over the course of this year to bring a series of recommendations to COP28. My understanding is that discussions ended with no agreement last weekend at the last scheduled transitional committee meeting. We're now about 5 weeks away from COP28. Another meeting has been set up in early November as a last-ditch attempt to try and deal with all of the most important issues that remain mired in disagreement, right? This relates to kind of whether this is going to be a fund as part of the financial mechanism under the UNFCCC, or if this is going to sit somewhere else, and the World Bank has been proposed by developed countries as a particularly suitable place. But questions about governance, structure, sources of funding, right? Are emerging economies going to be expected to provide some of this funding? It still hasn't really been addressed. And who's going to have access to this funding and how? How are we understanding this idea of vulnerability in this particular space? So in many ways, this isn't going to be surprising, and I'll be wrapping up in the next 10 seconds or so. This isn't going to be surprising to those who have followed the politics of loss and damage, and particularly climate finance more generally. I think with the adaptation fund, it was 8 years from a decision at COP before money went out the door for the adaptation fund. I think the timing for the Green Climate Fund was roughly similar. But this issue is so pressing. People are facing these losses already today, and they need help. And so this raises this question I would like to put to this group. How can real, meaningful progress on loss and damage, including the establishment of the fund, be achieved, given the deep divisions between developing and developed countries? what can those who are most vulnerable to the worst impacts of climate change expect on loss and damage at COP28? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a very, very important discussion to have. And I agree with you that I think more political scientists should be involved in this conversation. I also just want to note that a lot of young people and a lot of people from the youth movement, especially for impacted countries, are seeing, as you were mentioning, the World Bank being the host of the Loss and Damage Fund as something that's actually really problematic, because historically the World Bank has just caused more debt. And so it should be the UNFCCC, but then we have the problem of how the UNFCCC can't hold as much. And so we say that this is an unprecedented problem, so we need an unprecedented solution, and we need that political will, and really try to understand why global north countries are trying to block a lot of the climate finance in all aspects. But I think we have Professor Lavanya Rajamani to answer this question.
Thank you, Mitzi, and thank you, Lisa, for that sort of sweeping and very insightful overview of the loss and damage issue in the climate negotiations. I think perhaps I should start by speaking about sort of expectations, not just for the COP, but for how this issue can be addressed longer term. You pointed out that it had been first sort of accepted as an issue in the climate negotiations about 10 years ago. But actually, as an issue, it has been around, as you know, of course, since the early 90s, with the AOSIS proposal for the Framework Convention on Climate Change actually contained a provision on aspects of loss and damage. So it's been around for a long time. It has been a very frustrating process for many of the vulnerable nations to actually even have this issue acknowledged, as you've pointed out. And I think you're absolutely right. It's fundamentally about the different framings within which this issue can be approached. And we do have a very strong vulnerable versus emitters, major emitters sort of divide on this. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a north-south, but there's certainly a very strong vulnerable versus sort of major emitters divide on this. In terms of what can be expected within the process, I would say we need to manage our expectations of what can be expected within the process. Although the establishment of the fund/funding arrangements for loss and damage was hailed, as you said, as a sort of victory for climate justice in the media reportage, that is not what was actually in the decision, as you pointed out. And so the decision which started this entire process towards sort of establishment of this fund or funding arrangements was very carefully hedged and sort of heavily caveated. And the issues that were unresolved then are still unresolved, as you pointed out, and fundamental issues: who pays, who benefits, where the money is coming from. And then, of course, the sort of more technical issues around the governance framework for this. And the reason I think we will get an agreement, but I think a lot of the underlying issues will still be unresolved. We will get an agreement at COP28. But I think until the fundamental sort of political balance shifts, we are not likely to see a major breakthrough in this issue. And I think the fundamental realignment of the political balance will have to come from outside. And I think part of the work that's been going on outside, and by outside the process, I mean, for instance, sort of what's happening with the sort of advisory opinions before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, before the International Court of Justice, before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. These are issues that are going to center stage the climate justice question that, as you pointed out, has to some extent been taboo in the negotiations on loss and damage. Now, depending on the outcomes of these proceedings, different proceedings in different courts over the course of the next 18 months, we will hopefully begin to see a shift. Depending on how progressive those outcomes are, we will begin to see a shift in the political balance in the negotiations as well. So some of the stimulus has to come from outside. I think in addition to these advisory opinions that are sort of in the pipeline in the next 18 months, we are also seeing many cases, dealing with the liability question, especially with the advances in attribution science that you also referred to. So there are sort of cases in the pipeline, cases that have been decided as well, Human Rights Committee and in other fora, that will also provide some stimulus and impetus to the discussions inside the process. And of course, the human rights implications that you mentioned, Lisa, are sort of salient and hugely sort of important in this area. And one indication of that is, for instance, the work that's been done by the past two special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment, but also now the work that's ongoing with the special rapporteur, human rights special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And so we will begin to see a lot of impetus coming from outside, which will hopefully shift the political balance and allow us to actually begin to address some of the underlying framework and framing issues on loss and damage, rather than just tinkering at the margins, which is all the process has been able to do so far. So this is not a very satisfactory response, probably, to what your question was, Lisa. We're not going to get a big bang outcome at COP28, but I think in time the needle will move. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. And I think something that I wanted to emphasize there, but maybe I'm biased because I am coming from a youth climate justice activist point of view from the outside, is that we really need that push for that, as you mentioned, realignment of political balance. And it might not happen at this COP, but that's why we must continuously have that push within the international spaces, but also within our own countries and our own respective areas, to ensure that we get climate finance, and especially, and I know this word is a bit taboo as well, but reparations for the loss and damages that we experienced. Thank you so much for those wonderful insights. Okay, Mark, yes, go ahead if you want to add something.
So these are incredible sort of insights from Lisa and Lavanya. I just wanted to add also, I think that we need to build trust in international organizations. It is not surprising to anybody who's ever read any history that developing countries do not trust the World Bank. Okay, sort of like if you read John Perkins' brilliant book, sort of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, again in the 70s and 80s. But we're in a different era. So I think it's the burden is on the actual institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF. I mean, the International Energy Authority has done a great job in actually showing that they are looking after the world's energy, not just the actual oil and gas industries. And I think so we need that. So it's about trust. We need to build that trust from within those organizations so other countries can see that they might be the right organization to do it.
Thank you, Mark. And if there's nothing else on that, I would also like to call on Omnia El Omrani, who served as youth envoy to the president of COP27. Omnia, could you tell us about your experience at COP last year and about your hopes and expectations for this year's summit before sharing a question with the CCAG panel?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for also the incredible insights around loss and damage that was previously shared. I think I come in more from the side of the non-economic losses in terms of health. So I'm a medical doctor by background, and I started working on climate change since I was a third-year medical student, witnessing firsthand the impacts of climate change on the health of the community, particularly children and young people. And I saw how we as young people have been disproportionately shouldering the impacts of climate change, not only on our health and our mental well-being, but also on our basic access to food, water, education, and healthcare services. We know now that 90% of the diseases that are linked to climate change are going to affect children under the age of 5. And when we look at our education that is expected to be disrupted for over 38 million children every year because of climate change. Also, we see how young people are distressed. And as we were just talking about the lack of trust, which we are seeing because of the disconnect between what we need to see in terms of climate action and climate justice and what is being done by countries and institutions. And that is why, as young people, we believe that the fight against climate change and the reduction of carbon emissions is fundamentally about human rights and intergenerational justice. And we have been leveraging our activism, our voices, our actions, and our countries accountable for their lethargic responses. And because of our fundamental role as change agents, but also as equal partners, the COP27 presidency in Egypt decided to appoint a youth envoy for the first time in 27 years, a young representative in the presidency, to be the link between the insights, the solutions, and the policy asks that young people are developing, and to mainstream it and inject it directly into the design and the delivery of COP up to the political outcome decision. I was very fortunate to be appointed and to have that responsibility, especially that as young people, we have a sense of urgency and a responsibility, not just for us, but also for the generations that are now experiencing the impacts of climate change. And in terms of my experience over the last year, so I started by listening to young people, doing a diversity of consultations to understand what are the priorities that we would like to see. How do you want to see the outcome of COP27 differently when it comes to our role and when it comes to the way that we participate in terms of the challenges and the barriers that we faced, but also the opportunities of us being seen as natural partners to this multilateral process that is impacting us the most. In terms of the key outcomes that I would love to share is that what we did, and because every year for the last 18 years, there was always a conference of youth where young people gather from all over many countries, 100+ countries. And in Egypt, we had over 1,000 young people come in 3 days before COP to discuss and to see what are the policy asks across all the different streams of COP, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, as well as other areas, including food, health, human rights, and conflict of interest as well. And we developed the global youth statement that every year was given to the presidency in a ceremony, and then we did not see any concrete outcomes or how this statement was integrated. And that is why we decided to, together with the official youth constituency, Yongo, to develop a climate forum where we invited the negotiators, the chairs of the country groups, and the ministers to discuss with young experts. And we had two different roundtables, one focusing on adaptation and the second focusing on mitigation and just transition. And we had an open discussion where young experts and representatives were given the floor first to share their policy asks and recommendations and see how we can co-create policy asks together that were then rapporteured and integrated within the COP outcome decision. And this was the first time this sort of co-designed forum was implemented on the Youth Day at COP. We also had the first ever Children and Youth Pavilion, which was led by an incredible group of youth-led organizations, but also individuals. That was an independently youth-led space. And we had the opportunity to invite the policy actors, the negotiators, to come to us and have an open discussion and dialogue with young people, listening to our questions and our demands and paving a way forward. And then we wanted to make sure that this is not just a one-off appointment or a one-off effort, but to have that mandated for the next set of presidencies to do that. So in the COP27 outcome decision, the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, we had children and young people mentioned 11 times, but it's not just about the mention, it's also about how and what are the demands we're mandating the presidency to do. So the first is to mandate the next presidency to appoint a youth envoy. And we are very inspired to see now with the UAE presidency, there is a youth climate champion who is Her Excellency Shaima, the Minister of Youth of UAE, and she has an incredible team of amazing youth climate champion team who are working very hard to deliver for young people and to institutionalize the role further within the UNFCCC. We also requested the country delegations to recognize the role of young people in official country delegations as negotiators and not just as youth representatives, and to also have a children and youth pavilion and to also have a youth-led climate forum, not just on the Youth Day, but across all the thematic days where young experts are having open and equal discussions with the policy experts at COP every day. So a way that really having meaningful opportunities for the diverse voices of young people to be valued, heard, and meaningfully integrated within the decisions that are and the programs that are being developed throughout the 2 weeks of COP. But at the same time, it's not just about young people and our perspectives, it's also about our health, which is very fundamental, and we can see now the urgency of it. And this is why we can see for the first time COP28 is going to host a health day, a dedicated day for the health community, and also inviting ministers of health to come for the first time at COP with a declaration that is now being circulated. And my question now, and also coming from my role as the envoy, but also my background as a physician, is how can the health sector and the health community work together with the energy sector, and how can we work together to drive, as we have seen in the incredible findings of the report, the equitable transition of energy systems, the reduction of carbon emissions, the phase out of fossil fuels that is now negatively impacting the health of young people and children in particular. And to give more context to my question is that now we are developing a climate and health narrative using the arguments of the number of lives saved, but also the reduction of healthcare costs. So how can both sectors work together in service to that?
Thank you so much, Amnia, and thank you for the work that you've done, like really pioneering, ensuring the institutionalization of young people's voices in the presidency. Who would like to answer that question?
I think, unfortunately, Mitzi, it'll have to be me to start off with. So I'm incredibly lucky. I'm part of the Lancet Countdown Commission, and since 2015, we publish a paper every single year in the Lancet, the world's one of the greatest medical journals. Let's not get them too excited. And what we do is we look at lots of data that actually link climate change and global health. But I have to say, I think at the COP meetings where there have been health ministers before, and we have had special sort of events, but not a health day, I think the key thing is follow the money. And I know that sounds very strange, because the interesting thing is when you look at most countries, one of the biggest expenses of government and of individuals is their own health. And so therefore, when you have the health ministry and the finance ministry all together, as they will at COP, anything you can do to improve people's health and actually reduce health costs has a massive impact. For example, we all know that there are 8 million premature deaths every single year due to fossil fuel caused air pollution. Just imagine the saving if you'd actually got rid of that, okay? And that's just one of the key things. So I think what we need is to take incredible health professionals such as yourself. We get to the health ministers, we use the reports by the Lancet, and there's lots of other great pieces of research out there. We show them all the health benefits of dealing with climate change. But we also then show that those co-benefits also have incredible finance benefits. It basically reduces the cost of the healthcare, but it also improves productivity, improves sort of like wellness within a country, and then we can then follow it through. And it's that classic case, which is then you turn around to the finance minister and go, look, renewables are actually going to A, be cheaper, B, be safer. Politically, you don't have to be reliant on sort of like foreign countries. Oh, and by the way, look at all the health savings and look at all the money you're going to be able to save that you can then invest in other things. So unfortunately, it comes down to follow the money.
Thank you, Mark. And it's true, right? Like taking care of the planet is just better for society in general, right? It shouldn't be that hard to understand. And so now I want to introduce climate and sustainability advocate Aziz Abubakar, who joins us from Nigeria. Aziz, please give us your perspective on today's topic and share your question with our members.
Oh, thank you for having me today. My name is Aziz, and I'm the founder of Sustainable Solutions for Green Growth, which is a non-profit organization based in Nigeria. And we simply just find sustainable solutions to some of the world's biggest challenges, like climate change and environmental pollution, especially in vulnerable communities in Africa. So I appreciate the opportunity to address this esteemed panel and to share my experience at COP. For me, it was a unique conference that, in my view, can be encapsulated in a mixed bags of outcomes. First and foremost, I think COP 27 was significant for its focus on the loss and damage implementation, and it was happening to witness at COP last year, how several countries came together to agree on a step forward in addressing the severe impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities. And countries did agree to forming the Loss and Damage Fund. However, it's important to acknowledge that in other areas, the conference did not achieve the level of success that I had hoped for, and that many other young people had hoped for as well. But while it may not have yielded, those results, I think that the fact that it was hosted in Africa really served as a catalyst for driving support for African countries when it comes to the urgent need for assistance and the urgent need for support in adapting to the realities of climate change. As we look ahead at COP27, as we look ahead at COP28 rather, to be hosted in Dubai this year, our expectations are buoyed by the UAE's strategic role in the event, and I really think that the United Arab Emirates, with its unique geopolitical position and its commitment to sustainability, holds a lot of potential to shape the outcomes significantly. And I'm looking forward to seeing a platform created to ensure that countries across the world can make commitments, and as well to really drive co-creation and innovation, and to bring about the change that we want to see. Every year I'm always hopeful that COP is going to yield better results, and I really hope that the UAE's role in this COP this year is going to really help drive a lot of progress, particularly because the UAE is a country that's as one of the world's largest oil producing companies. So I'm really hopeful that we would be able to have a lot of political framework in place to helping mitigating the climate crisis and reducing carbon emissions. And I particularly want to ask this question and throw this out to the group. I'm more concerned about young people's inclusion and how young people could be meaningfully engaged in climate policies and decision-making processes. And my question is, what concrete steps can COP28 take to actively and meaningfully engage young people in the climate processes and the climate action agenda? And how can we ensure that youth voices are heard and that the ideas are integrated into the climate policies and decision-making processes at COP. I asked this question particularly because for a long time, young people have come up with different declarations and youth statements and global demands. However, we've seen little or no integration into the broader outcome of the COP conference. Myself, I've had the opportunity to attend the Youth for Climate events in Milan, Italy, and also in the US last year to really help shape the climate agenda. However, we've seen little or no integration of all of what we've come up with within the COP agreements. So yeah, I'm throwing out this question to the group. I don't know who would want to answer that.
Thank you so much, Aziz. Lorraine, would you like to answer this question?
I can, maybe just say something. I mean, I did wonder if maybe one mechanism here is so one of the I guess maybe less known articles of the Paris Agreement is Article 12, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE, which calls for education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information. And as part of that, it's also about bringing in youth, but also kind of wider public voices. So it's really about empowering people to be part of climate negotiations and part of kind of delivering climate action. So I know at COP26, which was hosted in the UK, the negotiators there agreed a 10-year work program to deliver this ACE obligation that countries have that signed up to the Paris Agreement. And so there should be kind of progress that is monitored through that in terms of to what extent is the public being brought in, how much dialogue is there empowerment of young people, for example. So that's maybe a mechanism through which that could be addressed and monitored. But yeah, so that was just one thought I had, but maybe others have other ideas.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think that might be all the time that we have left for today, but I just wanted to say, watch out for the reports that are coming out soon. A reminder that there is something that we can do and that there is a lot more trust and collaboration that needs to be built within international organizations and political leaders. And COP28 is something that is coming up soon, and we have a lot to do, but also beyond COP28, we must continue building that empowerment, raising awareness, and changing the world, really. So thank you always to our members and guests for joining us today. And please like and subscribe. Please share this video with your networks, and please keep advocating for the changes that we need to see in this world, because together we are able to do anything. Thank you, everyone.